Hello, how are you doing? It's an extremely rainy day here in London, but I have some daffodils here to cheer the place up. I love it at this time of year that daffodils are such a cheap and cheerful flower, aren't they? They never last that long, but it's good while they're here. Anyway, I have a pile of brand new books, many of which have just been published in February here in the UK that I want to discuss. I think they all sound really interesting. Some of them publishers kindly sent me and others I bought myself. And I'd love to know if you have read any of these books and if you'd recommend them, or are you interested in reading any of them now? To start off with, there are a couple of novels written by poets, and I always think it can be slightly dicey when poets write novels because sometimes they can be more focused on the language and flow of the sentences rather than, narrative and plot, but they sound really good. So there is Fury by Clyo Mendoza, translated by Christina McSweeney, and Mendoza is a Mexican author. And this novel is about a group of broken men. We follow their individual stories and people connected with them and how their lives are driven by love and violence, and many of them end up in the desert. One man in the desert believes that a cactus is his person that he loves, and about his connection with this cactus. So it sounds like very unique, and Mendoza also draws upon a lot of mythology to create her characters and write about these individual situations. So I'm interested to see how they all come together in this story. It also excites me that the author Catherine Lacey, who wrote Biography of X and Pew, that I really liked, endorses this book and says, "I loved the churning gyre of fury, an enigmatic and audacious novel that proves the truest stories aren't told, they're repeated." Then there is the highly anticipated novel Pity by Andrew McMillan, which is set in South Yorkshire and follows 3 generations of a mining family and how the landscape of the north of England changed so dramatically in the past few decades with industries dying out, but also how the conception of masculinity and many social issues have changed over that period of time. I loved Andrew McMillan's debut poetry collection, Physical, and I'm so interested to see what his novel is like. He has fans and authors like Douglas Stewart and John McGregor and Max Porter, and Porter says this beautiful book about the marks that are left on people and places in turn leaves a deep empathic mark on the reader. Meet Me at the Surface by Jodie Matthews. This is a novel about a woman who grew up in a farmhouse on the moors, which she eventually left, but she returns to her village for a memorial service and finds that things are much stranger than she remembered. So I think there's a number of mysteries at the heart of this story, and it's about homecoming and how much we can belong in the place that we came from. How I Won a Nobel Prize by Julius Taranto. This is a debut novel about a character named Helen, who's believed to be one of the best minds of her generation, and she's a graduate student, but her irreplaceable advisor gets involved in a sex scandal, so moves to a remote research institute, and Helen travels there with him. So it's about cancel culture and literature and messy relationships. Now, I've heard some criticism about this novel in the way that the author handles this female character. So there are lots of mixed opinions about this book, and I'm quite curious to see what I'll make of it. The Women by Kristin Hanna. This is a novel about a young trainee nurse in the mid-1960s, and one day she is told that women can be heroes, and this completely changes her point of view and perspective of the world because she's been raised in a very sheltered environment and been taught to be a good girl, but when her brother is drafted into fighting in Vietnam, she she also enlists in the army as a nurse, and it's about her experiences going to war and the heroic acts of women in wartime. I have never read anything by Kristin before, but I hadn't realized just how much she has written until I looked at her bibliography. Here it is. Yeah, look at all of those books. Such a long list. So I'm not sure if I'll like her fiction or not, but if you've ever read anything by her, let me know what you think. Art by Peter Carty. This is a novel set in London in the 1990s about a man who sets up a gallery for radical artists in an area of the city called Hoxton. So it's about this bohemian art scene, but also this up-and-coming area of the city, which there was a lot of buzz and excitement about, but how this brushed up against gentrification and urban crime. So it's meant to be darkly funny and a portrait of the city at a particular period of time. Next, I have a couple of reprints of short story collections by really interesting sounding authors. So there is Neighbours and Other Stories by Diane Oliver. And this is a collection about the civil rights movement in the American South in the 1960s and the lives of individuals that were affected by it. And Diane Oliver's was killed when she was only 22 years old, and she was a very promising author, and this new reprint has a beautiful cover, and it comes with an introduction by Tayari Jones. The author Paul Mendoza, whose writing I adore, says, Oliver exquisitely projects the biggest narrative of mid-century America, Jim Crow, onto the smallest, most insidious realities of everyday Black life. These stories are all gems. After a Dance by Bridget O'Connor, and these stories are about the lives of individuals at their best and their worst. So there are characters who are narcissists whose lives are unraveling, and there's stories about melancholy romantics. Bridget O'Connor was a writer that was working in a London canteen in the 1990s and writing short stories on the side. And she also became a screenwriter. She co-authored the script for Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, and she died in 2010. So I think this sounds like a fascinating collection. The author Roddy Doyle says, some of the wildest, most arresting, just plain brilliant short stories I've read in a long time. And I also have a debut short story collection called Sinking Bell by Bojan Louis, who's a Navajo writer. And these stories are set in and around the city of Flagstaff about characters who are struggling to work and raise families and also wrestling with feelings of self-destruction. A new poetry collection called Eggshell by Victoria Kennefick. And this collection explores motherhood and miscarriage and emotionally messy relationships. There are also some poems which seem quite humorous. I was very drawn to a poem called Bjork on Bjork's Swan Dress, and the poem is simply, they wrote about it like I was trying to wear a black Armani and got it wrong, like I was trying to fit in. Of course, I wasn't trying to fit in. And Bjork was a huge influence on me when I was growing up. So yeah, I was just immediately drawn to that. I don't know if that was an actual quote from Bjork or not, but I'm really interested to explore more of the poems in this collection. Claremont by Lesley McDowell. This is a proof of this new novel, and so this is what the finished cover looks like. And many people are aware of the famous trip that Percy and Mary Shelley took to Lake Geneva in 1816 to visit Lord Byron, during which Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein. But not many people are aware that the reason they went on that trip was because of Mary's stepsister called Claremont, and she was pregnant with Lord Byron's child. And so it follows her story and the emotional turmoil of this trip. And finally, I have a new nonfiction book called Will You Care If I Die by Nicolas Lunabba, who's a social worker in Sweden, and he meets a boy named Elijah who's at risk, and he takes this boy into his home to try to care and encourage him, even though he knows it's against his better judgment to do this and to take such a personal interest in a boy. And so it's about emerging gang violence in Sweden and the rise of the far right, and how boys are lured into this violent culture. It sounds like a really heartrending and meaningful story. So those are all the new books I want to talk about. Like I said, I'd love to know if you've read any of these books, or if you're interested in reading any of them, or if you have any new books that you're excited about reading soon. I'd love to hear about that in the comments below. But I hope you're doing well and staying dry if it's raining where you are, and I will speak to you again soon. Bye-bye.